Ema?
You can record too. I always forget. Thank you, Ellen. Oh my gosh. Okay.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yaron, I'm gonna make you host.
All right. So I'll say actually just before I go over to the sharing the screen that looking at, well, I guess both my parents in the same room, but on different screens. It's that room, there's I don't know if it's still in the same place, but my mom, I think, is right next to it on her left is the bookshelf of Kabbalistic literature, which I used to think was the beginning of my learning on this. But it turns out, yeah, there it is. So, but it turns out that it wasn't, right? The beginning of my learning was really the investigation of these biblical texts. And again, some of them really, even though I read through it, just remained uninvestigated. So we're going to jump into them. And let's see, share screen.
Yaron, can you give a very brief recap just for the recording, please?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so we're going to try today to set down the foundational texts for the Kabbalistic literature, for the Kabbalists, from where they pulled from the biblical text to really derive their understanding of the world. And because for them, if it didn't exist in the biblical, in the Torah, particularly in the Tanakh, it's like you couldn't prove it. You could only say that these were ideas for how the world might be or about how God might be. And then one other note, actually, before we get into the text, is that the goal of Kabbalah, and here we can, the goal of Kabbalah is oneness with God. And that oneness is established through knowledge of God. And that might seem already like a far reach for, again, the normal ways in which I think as Jews we engage maybe ritually or even with study. It might be about knowing the text, but it's not about knowing God. And this seems like, where would they get such a notion about that the goal would be to know God and to be one with God? And I think, again, what we'll see through these biblical texts is that it's deeply rooted in the tradition that they received. And the first text we're actually going to look at is from the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is roughly from the first 200 years of the Common Era, and is primarily a legal text. This is the opening of the Hagigah, which is in the second of the study, I think, and it sets limitations on certain things you're not supposed to study, or at least you're supposed to study in a very restricted fashion. So the first one, what they refer to here as the forbidden relations, are the certain sexual relations that are not allowed, that are discussed in Leviticus. So they may not expound upon the subject of forbidden relations in the presence of three, nor the work of creation, so the opening of Genesis, which we'll look at next week, in the presence of two, nor the work of the chariot in the presence of one. And the chariot in this case is Ezekiel's chariot, which we'll look at that one today, unless he is a sage and understands of his own knowledge. So already there's a very old tradition of limiting the study of these texts. And there's some debate, and we'll see actually a little bit of this debate in the Talmud on this, on how you're supposed to, what does it mean that you're only supposed to look at it with one other person, and how are they supposed to know it already, and how you're supposed to find that out. And then whoever speculates upon four things, it would have been better had he or she not come into the world. What is above, what is beneath, what came before, and what came after. Right, so these four things you're just never supposed to think about at all, right? And again, the goal of, I think, last week and the next few weeks is really to consider at least what is before and what is above. I'm not sure exactly about what is beneath, and possibly in some sense about what came and what comes after. So there's a very old tradition of of limiting, and there's also, we'll see, a very old tradition of really pushing the edges of those limits. But we can understand, I think, as we get into these texts, why they put some bounds on them, because they really do challenge our normal sense of, and we'll see actually at the the concluding passage, a sense of why these passages can be difficult to pull into our normal sense again of faith or theology and what that might be if not handled carefully. All right, so moving ahead, our first passage actually is not from the opening of creation, but this is from the sixth day of creation. This is in the first telling too. So in the Genesis has two creations of Adam. This is the first of the two of them. There's the one where it's taken, of Eve, when one of them is taken out of the rib, and this one has this has a different creation story. This is the first and principal one. It's from Genesis 1, verse 26. And God said, let us make man, or in this case, Adam, in our image and in our likeness. They shall rule. Well, the next part actually not so important, the ruling. And then skipping to the next part of the passage, and God created man in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. Right? So a few things to really note here. They really can't be kind of overlooked. This is the beginning of the Torah. This is the beginning of our knowledge of the world and of God. And God refers to God's self in the plural. So when God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Right? So why is the plural used here rather than the singular? And also, to be created in the image of God is to be both male and female. Right? So God here is plural for however you want to take that, and also male and female. And this is really important as we go deeper next week into the creation stories as understood by the Kabbalists and in the framework in which they see God and the universe. This idea that what they at least considered opposites. It's a question of whether we would consider male and female opposites exactly, but at least they considered opposites are contained in the same. Right? So already we have this notion of opposites in one, right, and also a plural in a singular, all at the same time. So that multiplicity can be singular and opposites can be contained in the same. And this is already just in the first chapter of Genesis. We set down this framework. We're going to jump now to our next passage. Actually was my bar mitzvah parsha, and Exodus 33, and this is when Moses is on Mount Sinai and is about to receive the Ten Commandments, and they're having this dialogue before the Ten Commandments are etched into stone and be brought down to the people on Moses' anxiety kind of about this dynamic and God leading. And Moses wants more. Moses wants a deeper knowledge. And the Lord said to Moses, so Moses has asked for more understanding of God. And the Lord said to Moses, I will do this thing that you have asked, for you have truly gained my favor, and I have singled you out by name. And Moses said, oh, let me behold your presence. And God answered, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Lord, Adonai, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the grace that I grant and compassion that I show. But God said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see my face and live. And Lord said, there is a place near me, station yourself on the rock. And as my presence passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away and you will see my back, but my face may not be seen. And so here, this passage is fairly explicit about a few things. And again, how we understand these images is a question still, but just want to put out there that the Torah itself is using terms that here God has a goodness, a presence, a face, a back, and a hand. Okay? Now, again, how we understand these images we'll deal with, and again, if they figure into both the deep Kabbalistic understanding, but even before that, again, just understanding the universe and God. Right? But even before that, I don't want us to presume that it's just metaphorical without an insight. Right? This part's so important, considering that while we might want to just see them, and we'll see this more explicitly with Maimonides, but we want them to see them and dismiss them as just metaphor so that we can understand it. Always when we're thinking about these passages, we should we should question that metaphors still teach us something about what the metaphor is about. It's not, if you say that you're like a cold drink on a hot day or something like that, whatever that, it's not, you understand that I'm not you're not actually a cold beverage made out of liquid, but you're refreshing. You still learn something about that a person or that action because of the metaphor. I just want to start. I'm wondering whether if this is popping up means, I have to admit people. I'm sorry. I don't know how long they've been waiting. Let's see. Put that over here. Maybe it'll be more pop up. Okay. And then it continues now. This is it's Exodus 34, but the same passage, the same story. And this you'll recognize from the high holiday services. And God passes before him and proclaims, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Bechanun Erech Apayim Rachesed Ve'emet Nosei Chesed La'alafim Nosei Avon V'Pesha Chatav V'Nakeh. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, Lord, Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. That God does not remit all punishment, but visits the inequity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generations. This is God's self-definition of God's attributes and also God's goodness. Which is a passage that I think my mom is about to teach Crew for his bar mitzvah, almost up to it in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, when Moses first meets God at the burning bush, is another important point of self-definition, where God, when Moses asks God's name and God answers, yeah, Asher, yeah, I will be as I will be, or I am as I am. These self-definition moments are also very important for the Kabbalists as they consider what is God, who is God, and how that figures into their understanding into the universe at large, into the world at large. So this is here a moment of self-definition, but God has already discussed God's own face and back, hand, goodness, presence, and these divine attributes, which are for at the close of the Seder, the 13 divine attributes that are sung in Who Knows One. And our next passage, we're now going to jump to the prophets. This is Isaiah 6. And this also includes a passage probably you all recognize from Shabbat morning. And this is in the year that King Uzziah died. This is Isaiah speaking. I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. The seraphim stood in attendance on God. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. The he here is the seraphim, not God. And with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melech ha'aretz kavado. Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. God's presence fills all earth. Right, so here's this vision that Isaiah is having of the temple, in which God is sitting on a throne. There are robes that are filling the entire room, and angels that are surrounding, and they end up engaging with Isaiah as the narrative continues. But these particular angels, which are called seraphim, are around the room. But here, I think one thing, in addition to this, like kind of crazy or not such to call it crazy, but just unexpected vision of biblical vision for God sitting in a robe on a throne. There's a very important, again, opposites contained in the same here. Because here's God in a particular place on a throne, but the final line is holy, 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 Lord of hosts. God's presence fills all earth. So how could God is both here in one place sitting on a throne, but the presence fills all earth. There's a sense of finiteness and infinity in the same notion, right? So these all will figure in very critically into the ways in which I think the Kabbalists continue to push these questions of opposites contained in the same, or moments of access and learning that aren't at the same time limiting. Right? And this high wire walk of having a sense of knowledge, of particular knowledge of the positive, while not limiting the knowledge of God, is already here expressed in Isaiah. Right? He's having what's considered an authentic vision of God that is not a limiting vision of God somehow at the same time. The next one is the one we're not supposed to study, Ezekiel 1. I've skipped the first 25 verses of it. It's set up that Ezekiel's at the river Kfar, and the first 25 verses primarily or entirely are on everything that's below the chariot in which the semblance of God, which we'll have in verse 28, is sitting on. And they're these incredible creatures of 4 faces and 6 wings and wheels with eyes and fire. And Ezekiel describes them in unbelievable detail. And they turn depending on which direction they're going. And again, one is a human face, and the other 3 are animal faces. And these are called cherubim, kruvim in the Hebrew there. But now we're on to the part that's above the head of these creatures on the chariot itself. Above the expanse over their heads, and here again, there is the kruvim, the cherubim, these 4-headed creatures. Above their head was the semblance of a throne, an appearance like sapphire, and on top, upon the semblance of the throne, there was a semblance of a human form. Now, in a way that's already so different from the vision from Isaiah, it's really important here to note the continued use of the Hebrew demut, or the semblance that's in here in the translation. It's not saying it was a throne, and it's not saying it was a human form, but a semblance of a throne and a semblance of a human form. And even the sapphire it's not sapphire, it's an appearance like sapphire. So we're already getting a sense of a mediated vision on one hand, and this question of what you can see directly and what's a semblance of also, again, will figure into our imagination of the limits of our insight, the limits of what we can know. From what appeared as his loins up, and this is referring to this, now we're referring to the semblance, as his loins up, I saw a gleam of amber, what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a radiance all about him. The scholar Howard Schwartz has noted in the reading of this passage that the vantage point, or the focal point here, are the loins, or he's describing from the loins up and the loins down. Though there is no direct description of the loin, though it's maybe described here in the next verse, like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on a day of rain. So like a rainbow, such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. So before, while it wasn't described what this semblance was of, here Ezekiel defines it. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. Now, there's so many questions to ask about this text, but one of them that strikes me too is why this one would be prohibited when the one of Isaiah is not, and the next one, which we'll read, why the one from Daniel isn't prohibited. Right? So what is different about this vision of Ezekiel that requires it to be such a limited study? And we haven't looked at the whole passage. We can't answer that in full, but already we should be wondering, what is it about this that remains different in the imagination of already in the time of the Mishnah? And we'll see this played out in a passage in the Talmud. The last biblical passage we'll look at is from the book of Daniel. So now we're in the writings. We're in the 3rd section of Tanakh. And Daniel's an incredibly difficult book, period, partly because it's written in Hebrew and in Aramaic, and sometimes in the same chapter. This is a chapter that's written in Aramaic. And the book of Daniel is filled with the visions of a dream interpretation of others, but this one's his own vision, which there are a few of. And this now too, we're in the court in what's here called the Ancient of Days, what God is called the Ancient of Days. As I looked on, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took God's seat, their seat. His garment was like white snow, and the hair of the Ancient of Days' head was like lamb's wool. The throne was tongues of flame; its wheels were blazing fire. So here again, when we look at this passage, we have a Ancient of Days, Atik Yomin, which is a term that will be used throughout the Kabbalistic literature. and a garment that's white as snow. So there's garment, a head that's like lamb's wool, which I think is both a description of color and texture, and the throne, which is tongues of flames. And these wheels below it, which also the wheels appear too in the vision of Ezekiel, blazing fire. And a river of fire streamed before the Ancient of Days. Thousands upon thousands served. Myriads upon myriads attended the Ancient of Days. The court sat and the books were open. Right? So there are myriads, thousands of attendants, of angels of sorts that are in this room, and books that are open in this room also. Right? So these are all visions that are appearing, and notions of God that are appearing within the Bible itself, and they figure into the core information of which the Kabbalists are then, and not only Kabbalists, actually we'll see, already the early rabbis are trying to understand in their engagement with the divine. And we think that this might be limited to the Torah or to the prophets only. But in the 7th page of the Talmud, we already have a rabbi who has his own vision of going into the court of God. And this is in Brachot. And this is Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. And sorry, I gotta move around things here so I can see it. Here we go. Similarly, it was taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yishmael, this is by the way, the translation from Safaria, an online resource. Everything that's in bold is the translation. Everything that's not in bold is filling in the blanks. So we'll include some, we won't include some of that. It was taught, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha was for Yom Kippur once entered the innermost sanctum to offer incense. And there I saw Akatriel Yah, the Lord of hosts, seated upon high and exalted in an exalted throne. And the Lord and God said to me, Ishmael, my son, bless me. So this is, Ishmael is now in a court of God, seeing God on a throne, and God asks for a blessing. And Ishmael replies, may it be your will that your mercy overcome your anger, and may your mercy prevail over your attributes. And may you act towards your children with the attribute of mercy, and may you enter before them beyond the letter of the law. And the Lord of hosts and God nodded God's head and accepted the blessing. So here we are at the beginning of the Talmud, and there's already a story, right? This doesn't end. This is so important that it doesn't end in the prophets, and it doesn't end in Daniel and his visions. The Talmud basically begins with the story of one entering into the court of God. And Rabbi Yishmael, whether or not it's actually his is some debate, but it probably isn't, is attributed a book called Shiur Koma, which is roughly from the 6th century, so 500 years after this, which literally spells out the exact measurements of God. Like the foot of God is 200 million parasangs, and the forehead of God, the head of God in circumference is 3 billion parasangs, and the eye is this large, and the pupil is this large, and so on. And it's a side of kind of divine knowledge that maybe overall it doesn't end up becoming part of the mainstream of Kabbalistic literature, but it's attributed to Rabbi Ishmael already from here, because here at the beginning of the Talmud, there's the sense that one enters into the court, that this is a possibility. And we'll look at 2 more Talmudic passages. This one is from Hagigah, which is an interpretation of the limitations of the text that we began with. And we're not going to read this whole thing, but the things I'm going to kind of browse through it quickly, which is we're here at a story with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great 1st century rabbi, and a student of his, Rabbi Elazar ben Arak, and they're traveling along the way. And Rabbi Elazar wants Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to teach him about the Merkava, the chariot of Ezekiel. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, I'm not allowed to do this. You have to be able to do it yourself. So Rabbi Elazar wants to give it a try. And he goes to give it a try. And as soon as he begins, we're now at the bottom of this page. immediately Rabbi Elazar ben Arach began the design of to discuss the divine chariot, the Maaseh Merkavah, and expound it. And fire descended from heaven and encircled all the trees, and all the trees began reciting song. So as soon as he begins, the fire comes down, the trees are singing, and it will continue on. And they're singing a verse from Psalms, from Tehillim. And what's important, one of the things that's so beautiful about this passage is it does not tell us what Rabbi Elazar ben Arach said. It skips over that part, but we just know that an angel comes down and says, so an angel responded from the fire saying, this is the very design of the Merkavah. He got it exactly right. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gives him a kiss, his student a kiss, and they continue on their way. But here they have divine confirmation that a human understanding of the Maaseh Merkavah through the book of Ezekiel is in fact a correct description of the chariot of God. And as from this probably basis, from this beginning, there'll be a whole literature, early Kabbalistic literature, to define and understand what this Merkavah is, and also the Hechalot, which are like the temples of God, and to understand those. But again, those all kind of continue to move away as we get into more properly a question of understanding God more directly instead of through these visions, but rather through the Torah. And this is another famous passage continued on from the same interpretation of the Mishnah, of the limitation of study. And these are the four that entered Pardes, the orchard. And the part here I want to note is Rabbi Akiva, the great rabbi and martyr Rabbi Akiva, has one piece of advice for his students who are coming with him. And it says to them, when you get to the court of God and you reach the pure marble stones, do not say water, water, because it is stated, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before God's eyes. You can't say anything false before God. But what's the false thing? It's the opposite of what we might expect. If you think it's pure marble, it is pure marble, right? You think it would say, when you get to the court of God and it's this ephemeral, non-tangible space, and you think it's marble, it's in fact clouds, or it's in fact water. And here it's the opposite. When you think that you might think that it's water, in fact, it's pure marble. It's in fact something that you could touch. And it's such an unexpected turn, right? This would be the only piece of advice. And it's something we have to be wondering why we have here this tradition of it being something real, rather than something that's metaphorical. And all of this kind of figures into these questions of understanding the domain of God and of God. We're now going to jump from the Babylonian Talmud to Maimonides, so it's the 12th century. And this is from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is a legal codex and kind of the more traditional version of Maimonides. And this is his first principle of the foundations of Torah. The foundation of the foundations and firmest pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a first being, and this first being caused all beings to be, and that all beings from heaven and earth and from between them could not be saved for the truth of God's own being. So in short, everything is God. This is the first foundation for Maimonides. But the question is, again, are the limits of knowledge for it? And Maimonides does not really address that in Foundations of Torah, but does in the Guide for the Perplexed. We're going to skip this next one, which is about the question of metaphor, because it's the more traditional version of Maimonides. And the Guide for the Perplexed is written in Judeo-Arabic, not in Hebrew, and it's a deeply technical philosophical text. The right is actually the Hebrew translation, and the left is the English translation. And this is his discussion of the scene of Exodus that we saw, of Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. The wisest man, our teacher Moses, asked two things of God and received a reply respecting both. The one thing he asked was that God should let him know God's true essence. The other, which in fact Moses asked first, was that God should let him know God's attributes. In answer to both these petitions, God promised that God would let Moses know all of the attributes and that there was nothing but God's actions. God also told him that God's true essence cannot be perceived and pointed at by a method pointed out a method by which Moses could obtain the utmost knowledge of God possible for man to acquire. The knowledge obtained by Moses has not been possessed by any human being before him or after him. Moses' petition to know the attributes of God is contained in the following words. Different translation of the same passage, though, knowing the kavod, the presence of God, the glory of God. Consider how many excellent ideas are found in the expression in the words, show me thy way that I may know you. We learn from them that God is known by God's attributes. For Moses believed that Moses knew God, and Moses was shown the way of God. The words that I may find grace in your sight apply that Moses knows that God finds grace in God's eyes. Not only is he acceptable and welcomed, not only is he acceptable and welcome to God who fasts and prays, but everyone who knows God. He or she who has no knowledge of God is the object of God's wrath and displeasure. So here, it is not enough to be observant and to keep the laws, right? To become within the favor of God means to know God. This is a foundation of practice in some sense, for my mind here, being Jewish is to know God. Now, given everything we've read, we have to ask, what does this mean? To know God, and this is mostly what we'll get into in the next 2 weeks. And this is our final passage for today. But before we get too far down this road of these corporeal images, this is a text from Moses Cordovero, who's a Kabbalist and Sfat in the 16th century, and a contemporary of Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist, who notions are associated with notion of tzimtzum, the contraction of God, or tikkun olam. It kind of begins a bit with Isaac Luria. And some of you actually may have been into the synagogue of Moses Cordovero. It's still there. And this is from Or Ne'arav, which is like the pleasant light, and it's his introduction of sorts to try to get people to be convinced to study Kabbalah and its value. An impoverished person thinks that God is an old man with white hair sitting on a wondrous throne of fire that glitters with countless sparks, as it is written. And this is the passage we saw from Daniel. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. God's garment was white as snow, and the hair of God's head was like lamb's wool. God's throne was tongues of flame. Imagining this and similar fantasies, the fool corporealizes God. He or she falls into one of the traps that destroys faith. His or her awe of God is limited by this imagination. But if you are enlightened, you know God's oneness. You know that the divine is devoid of bodily categories. These can never be applied to God. Then you wonder, astonished, who am I? I am a mustard seed in the middle of the sphere of the moon, which itself is a mustard seed within the next sphere. So it is with that sphere, and all it contains in relation to the next sphere. So it is with all the spheres, one inside the other, and all of them are a mustard seed within the further expanses. And all of these are a mustard seed within the further expanses again. Your awe is invigorated, the love in your soul expands. So I think what I wanted to end with this passage is before we get too tied up in these images, these corporeal images, and these questions of whether they are kind of real or not, or what we learn from them. This passage from Cordovero reminds us that they are the mustard seed. They are the hints to understand the deeper circles, but they are only the beginning of them, right? And that I think similar to our sense of, or at least to my sense of the universe, is that we are reminded of our tininess as we understand as we try to have the deeper knowledge of the universe, or in this case, I think for Moses Cordovero, of God, that we don't find these attributes or these little bits of knowledge as making things smaller, right? So it's not that as we understand the positive attributes that God might have something that is related to a face or a hand or a back, or that or of the 13 divine attributes, or of a throne or lamb's wool, that these things aren't about limiting, right? These are the facts that begin to formulate our sense of the grandness, of the hugeness, of the circles upon the mustard seed within the sphere and the expanses and so on. They're not the limiting, they're the beginning of the knowledge and not the end of knowledge. So that for the Kabbalists, these passages weren't defining, right? They weren't the end of it. They were just the entrances from which we would understand the deeper secrets. So that when we, again, I hope that this is right in the comparison to physics, these beginnings of understanding the rules of the universe, right? That for, let's say, Einstein, about someone falling in an elevator and experience weightlessness, right? These answers, or these clues to these answers, they don't shut off the wonder. They just begin to open up the wonder of what's greater. All right, so that race through it is what I had in mind with 1 minute to spare, but I'm happy to stick around for questions.
Yaron, do you want to end the share?
Yeah.
Or do you want to do the Sphirot? I saw there was one more.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. It's too much to try to start down with 1 minute.
And there was a question about sharing PowerPoints. Yes, they're available. I don't know. I think Sam already shared his PowerPoint with me, and it's actually posted on the Kol Ami website under Adult Education. There's now a link to Kabbalah and Physics and Dialogue. So you can access the recordings and the PowerPoints. Yaron will send his and we'll upload.
Sure.
So it's all accessible.
Oh, Alan?
Yaron, good to see you and thank you. A problem I have is that Sam's presentation dealt with formulating theories, testing those theories, proving them right or wrong, and moving on to the next hypothesis. That element of being able to test a construct, I think, is missing here. And for me, that makes it difficult to hold Kabbalah and physics in the same set of hands.
Yeah, I hope I'm not presenting Kabbalah as rigorous or scientific in the way that, you know, physics, cosmology, or understanding. I don't want to establish equivalence, or even when we get into their notions for the creation of the world, that they had somehow access, some deep insight that preceded the science. But that I think I would say, like, rather that when we try to formulate the way that we see the world, I would say probably most of us don't hold at all times whatever understanding we have of physics. We don't hold at all times in our consciousness and the way we see the world, even if we have it. And that part of what we do and the way we engage in the world every day is to hold kind of the foundational narratives of how we understand the world, whether they are rigorous or not. So let's just say, I think that's something that came up last week, and even if we want to metaphoricize the sense of matter and antimatter and whether the creative or destructive forces will win out, these are stories that we're telling ourselves that are based in a sense of science, but we've established to it a kind of a moral and narrative order to it that the science of it doesn't care about. You know, that is the way it is. But we use these things to understand and engage with the world. And part of what I think the Kabbalists are trying to do here is figure out how we're seeing and engaging with the world, right? What are the stories the foundational stories in which we can encounter the everyday and the realities of the everyday, both as they're deriving it from the Torah, but also, again, in their lived experience day in and day out. Do we see a world, which we do, see a world around us that is, well, like we're seeing on the screen, individual faces and blades of grass and all sorts of locations and that separate. And at the same time, and maybe differences that we would see in sex or in things that seem oppositional, of light and dark, of opposition of wet and dry, or matter and antimatter, all these things. Do we see these things? Do we see the world as ultimately divided, or do we see the world as unified somehow underneath that? So the Kabbalists are trying to understand, well, again, do we approach the world as differentiated, or do we approach the world as one? Right? And this is, I think, in a sense, when we're willing to go there, is the consistent theological question of, if one says on one hand says in the Shema, hear Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one, in the sense of oneness, right? And at the same time, we might ask at the end of Aleinu, on that day, God will be one and God's name will be one. Right? How do we hold these two things that seem oppositional together at the same time? Is the world one or not one? Is the world one and divided? And so on. So that these questions and how we see the world, are what they're trying to set out. It's not saying it's scientific or rigorous, but I don't think we hold scientific and rigorous notions of how we see the world every day anyway. And this is another way of which we're doing it. I tell myself structures for how the world works to get through it every single day. This is one of those ways to do it. I think the difference between, I think even science at its times is trying to balance out those two measures of how we want to see the world. I even think Sam said something which really stuck with me, this question of, do certain scientists looking at neutrino hope that there's balance or imbalance? Like these questions of like, what would it mean, right? To where we find these, wanting a result almost, right? And where do we, what does it mean for there to be 1/billionth of an imbalance, right? These things end up taking on meanings that are not only about the rigor of the science.
Yaron, thank you. Very helpful.
Yaron, this is Kathy. Thanks for that reply. As a scientist for decades, this paradoxical, dialectical question that's being brought up, I think, is foundational and is actually at the heart of what you and Sam are doing, because we live at a time where the age of empirical science dominates the story, and we think the zeitgeist is that that's the truth. But Sam started his discussion of science and saying, I'm not going to get you all the way there. And so for me, part of why I wanted to join this conversation is because I think you and Sam are getting to this paradoxical essence of knowing and challenging the, I actually think the growth out of proportion to what we have in terms of knowing from the world of science. And we're coming up against questions we can't yet answer in that lens of knowing. And so I just want to thank you for bringing this conversation, because really what you're saying is the Kabbalists were asking, how do we bring things that seem exactly opposite together as one? And I think in my experience of these first two conversations, you and Sam are helping us do that.
Thanks. So one thing that Sam said last week too, that just stuck with me in these ways in which we address this question of what we can't know, and I hope I get this right, that is, we can know up to, I think it was like one Planck time to the negative 30 seconds of after the beginning of the inflation is where we can begin to start understanding what happened. But before that, there's it's not that we know a little bit, and we might know more, but as far as now, is you can't know anything at all. Yeah, did I get that, Sam? Is that right? Yeah, and I think for that idea that there remains areas that are totally outside of our set of knowledge, we'll see also carries into the Kabbalah sensibility for these questions at the beginning. But it's also this in what we do with what we can't know, and also what we do with this area that we're trying to know, but maybe we do consider in range, but we know we're getting it wrong along the way to getting it right. And I think that too is just a beautiful way of engaging with the world that remains kind of this reminder that we're a mustard seed, and a mustard seed that, what vision of the universe does a mustard seed have? like nothing, and what's so incredible about physics is that though we are only a mustard seed, we can know back to the negative 32nd, or the minus 30, negative to the negative 32nd power, negative 32nd power in time, where we can know that far, and we can see so far with telescopes. And in some sense, again, though I understand it's definitely not rigorous or scientific, that the Kabbalists were trying to understand what they can't see to the deepest level of their possibilities. And what does it mean to engage in that way and hold a mindset of the limits of one's knowledge all the time, right? When we generally interact with the world like we know where things are going. And even like in the way we assess risk every day, I think it's like something that's been so interesting the last few months, right? All of us trying to assess these levels of risk based on a presumption that we can understand things that really we don't know, but we're acting in these, trying to find these ways of certainty. These are all stories we're telling ourselves to try to figure out what to do. And how we balance these questions of what we know and don't know and how we're willing to act based on that is kind of what's underlying so much of these questions, I think.
So I'm unmuting myself so that we have a way to close. We might have begun this way, but thinking about last week and this week, I'm thinking about the blessing that we say when we engage in the study of Torah, that is Torah in its widest sense of learning. Some of you know this blessing, could recite it in your sleep, and it ends with the words, La'asok b'divrei Torah, and I would love to say it together, just blessing these moments of learning that we have. And you can unmute yourselves or listen, either way.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
So Yaron and Sam, and you've launched us into wonderful learning. And for Kol Ami people, and we'll send out an easier way to link in. I'm sorry that it was difficult, but we'll resend, and I suppose the day before, so that you have it more accessible. And my heart is so full with gratitude for the learning. And have a wonderful day, everyone. And a day of many blessings. And yes.
Very nice.
Thank you, Yaron. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay well.
Yes.
Thank you, Yaron and Sam.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Absolutely mind-blowing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I'm back.